There are routines in this work that become as natural as breathing, and breaking them feels like stepping off a cliff in the dark. I'm Marcus Delacroix, and I've kept the grounds at Riverside Memorial for 18 years. Started when I was 22, fresh out of community college with a landscaping certificate and no real understanding of what it meant to tend a place where people come to say goodbye. The work teaches you things they don't cover in any manual: how to read grief in the way someone walks between headstones, how to give mourners space while still making sure they feel safe, how to maintain dignity in a place where dignity matters more than anywhere else. Riverside sits on 43 acres of rolling hills overlooking the Susquehanna River. We've got sections dating back to 1852, with newer plots spreading toward the eastern boundary. The old sections are my responsibility sections, A through M, where the stones are weathered limestone and marble, where the trees have grown tall enough to create natural cathedral spaces between the graves. It's peaceful work, mostly. Mowing, trimming, keeping the pathways clear, making sure the headstones stay level and readable. I've got my routes, my schedules, my rhythms. Section K sits about halfway up the main hill, shaded by a stand of oak trees that must be 80 years old. It's one of the prettier spots in the cemetery, which is probably why the plots there filled up by the mid-1900s, except for K127. That plot has stayed empty since I started working here, though I never really thought about it until the woman began visiting. The first time I noticed her was a Tuesday in early September, just as I was finishing my afternoon rounds. I was walking back toward the maintenance shed when I saw someone moving through Section K figure in a long gray coat, carrying something in her hands. That wasn't unusual. People visit at all hours, and I've learned not to intrude unless someone seems lost or distressed. But something about her movement caught my attention. She walked with such purpose, such certainty, like she'd made this journey 1,000 times before. I watched from a distance as she knelt beside plot K127. From where I stood, maybe 50 yards away, I could see her placing something on the ground flowers, it looked like. She stayed there for several minutes, and I swear I could hear her voice, though the words were lost in the wind. When she stood and walked away, she moved with that same deliberate pace, following the path down toward the main gate. I didn't think much of it at first. People sometimes visit empty plots. Maybe they're considering purchasing, or they have family buried nearby. But the next Tuesday, at exactly the same time, she was back. Same gray coat, same careful walk to K127, same ritual of kneeling and placing flowers. By the third week, I had to check the burial records. The office keeps detailed logs going back to the cemetery's founding, and I'd learned to navigate the system during my first few years when I needed to help visitors find specific graves. Plot K127 was listed as available, had been since the cemetery was laid out. No burials, no reservations, no pending sales. According to every record we had, that patch of ground had never held anyone. But the woman kept coming. Always Tuesday, always 3:47 in the afternoon. I started checking my watch when I saw her. Always with flowers, always lilacs, even in October when lilacs shouldn't have been blooming anywhere in Pennsylvania. I tried to get closer once, taking a deliberately slow route with my equipment so I could pass near Section K around the time of her visits. But she seemed to sense my approach and would be gone by the time I reached that part of the cemetery. Just gone, like she'd never been there at all. That's when I thought about the security cameras. Riverside installed a basic system about 5 years, agonizing, elaborate, just enough coverage to discourage vandalism and help families feel safe visiting after dark. One of the cameras covers the intersection of paths near Section K, angled to catch anyone approaching that area. I asked Tom Hendricks, our facilities manager, if I could review some footage. Told him I was trying to identify someone who might be leaving items on an empty plot. Tom's been here longer than anyone, and he knows how seriously we take keeping accurate records of who's buried where. He gave me access to the security office and showed me how to navigate the system. The footage was clearer than I'd expected. There she was on the Tuesday recordings, walking up the path towards Section K at exactly 3:47 p.m. Gray coat that reached almost to her ankles, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, probably in her 70s. She carried herself like someone who'd lived through decades of loss and learned to bear it with grace. In her hands, a small bouquet of lilacs, tied with white ribbon. I watched her approach plot K127, watched her kneel in the grass, watched her lips move as she arranged the flowers. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but I could see her clearly a real person, not a shadow or a trick of light. She stayed for about 10 minutes each visit, sometimes reaching out to touch the ground where a headstone would be if there was one to touch. But here's what disturbed me more than anything. When I fast-forwarded through the footage, looking for the moment she left, she simply wasn't there anymore. One frame showed her kneeling by the plot, the next frame showed empty grass. No walking away, no standing up and departing. Just there, then not there. I started planning my rounds to intersect with her visits. If she was some kind of optical illusion or camera glitch, I'd figure it out by seeing the space with my own eyes at the right time. The next Tuesday, I positioned myself in Section J with a clear line of sight to K127. 347 arrived, and there she waits exactly as she appeared in the footage, kneeling beside the empty plot with her lilacs. I started walking toward her, not trying to be stealthy, just approaching at a normal pace like I was continuing my rounds. She seemed focused on whatever she was doing, head bowed, lips moving. I got within 20 feet before she looked up. She smiled at me, not startled, not defensive, just a gentle, sad smile like she'd been expecting me. Her face was lined but kind, with pale blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of Tuesday afternoons just like this one. She looked exactly like someone's grandmother, someone who'd spent a lifetime taking care of other people and was still taking care of someone, even here. "Lovely afternoon," she said. Her voice was soft but clear, with the slight accent of someone who'd grown up in rural Pennsylvania decades ago. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, stopping a respectful distance away. "Those are beautiful flowers." She glanced down at the lilacs in her hands. His favorites. He always said they reminded him of the spring we met. She looked back up at me. "Do you work here?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm Marcus, the groundskeeper for this section." "It's a beautiful place," she said. "Peaceful. He would have liked it here." I wanted to ask who she was talking about, wanted to understand why she was visiting an empty plot, but something in her expression stopped me. There was a completeness to her grief, a settled quality that made questions feel intrusive. "I'll let you visit," I said instead. "Thank you." She turned back toward the ground, and I continued walking, taking a wide path around her to finish my route. When I looked back a few minutes later, she was gone. The lilacs were there, arranged neatly on the grass, but no sign of the woman who'd placed them. I knelt where she'd been kneeling. The flowers were real. I could feel the texture of the petals, smell their sweet fragrance, but the ground beneath them felt different somehow, warmer than the surrounding earth, like someone had been lying there recently, warming the soil with their presence. That night I went through the burial records again, going back further than I'd looked before. I searched for any mention of lilacs, any burial that might have been moved or relocated, any administrative error that might explain why someone would visit an empty plot with such devotion. Nothing. But I did find something else. In the original cemetery plans from 1852, plot K127 was marked differently from the others. Instead of being designated for burial, it was marked as a memorial spacé, place set aside for remembrance of those whose remains couldn't be recovered or properly interred. The notation was brief, reserved for the lost. The woman continued her Tuesday visits through October and into November. I stopped trying to approach her directly, but I'd positioned myself where I could observe from a distance. She never varied her routine 3:47 p.m., gray coat, lilacs tied with white ribbon. Sometimes she'd speak to the empty ground. Sometimes she'd just sit quietly. Always, she'd disappear between one moment and the next, leaving only the flowers and that strange warmth in the earth. I found myself looking forward to her visits, though I couldn't have explained why. There was something comforting about her faithfulness, her refusal to let absence diminish devotion. In a place where people came to mourn and remember, she seemed to understand something about love that transcended the physical boundaries of graves and headstones. December brought the first hard frost, and I assumed her visits would end. But on the first Tuesday of the month, there she was again, kneeling in the gray coat beside plot K127. When I checked later, the lilacs were there as always, though by then no lilacs should have been blooming anywhere in Pennsylvania. That's when I realized I'd stopped questioning what I was seeing and started simply accepting it. In this work, you learn that grief follows its own logic, that love finds ways to persist even when logic says it shouldn't. Maybe the woman visiting Section K was something I'd never understand, but her presence felt as natural as any other part of tending these grounds. The last time I saw her was a Tuesday in late December, just before the cemetery closed for the holidays. Snow had started falling that afternoon, large flakes that caught the light and made everything look softer, more peaceful. She was there at her usual time, though the gray coat was harder to distinguish against the gray sky. I watched her through the snow, kneeling beside the empty plot, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw someone kneeling beside her, a shadowy figure that might have been a man, might have been nothing more than the way snow falls between trees. When spring came, her visits stopped. I still walk through Section K every Tuesday at 3:47, and sometimes I catch the scent of lilacs on the wind, even when none are blooming nearby. Plot K127 remains empty according to our records, but it doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels like a place where someone is remembered, where love continues to tend to absence with the same care I tend to these grounds. I never did learn who she was, or who she was visiting, but I've come to understand that some kinds of faithfulness don't require explanations. In 18 years of groundskeeping, I've learned that the most important work isn't always visible, and the most sacred spaces aren't always marked with stones. There are sounds in the old mausoleum that don't belong to the living, but I never expected one of them to be breathing. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I've supervised cemetery operations at Mount Carmel for 11 years. Started in the office doing intake and scheduling, worked my way up to overseeing grounds, maintenance, burial coordination, and facility management across 68 acres of rolling hills and forest. It's demanding work that most people don't think about until they need it, but I've always found purpose in maintaining places where families come to remember and mourn. The living need these spaces to feel sacred and peaceful, and that responsibility sits heavy on everyone who works here. Mount Carmel dates back to 1897, with sections that range from simple headstones to elaborate family monuments. The original mausoleum was built in 1908 by the Henley family, prominent mill owners who wanted something grand enough to house 3 generations of their dead. It's a Gothic revival structure built from local limestone with 24 individual vaults arranged in 2 levels. Beautiful craftsmanship, but the building shows its minor water damage, temperature fluctuations, the occasional need for masonry repair. My office is in the administration building, about 200 yards from the mausoleum, but I make rounds through all our facilities several times a week. The Henley Mausoleum requires more attention than our newer structures. The heating system is original and temperamental. The humidity control needs constant monitoring, and families expect everything to be perfect when they come to visit their loved ones. We installed a basic security system 3 years ago. After some vandalism in the older sections, nothing elaborate, just cameras covering the entrances and main pathways, plus infrared monitoring inside the mausoleum to detect any unauthorized entry. I was reviewing the security footage on a Thursday morning in late October when I noticed something odd. The infrared camera inside the mausoleum showed a strange pattern on vault door 15, what looked like condensation forming and dissipating rhythmically on the inside surface of the glass. The timestamp showed it happening between 2:17 and 3:41 a.m., creating a cloudy patch that appeared and faded every few seconds, like someone breathing against cold glass on a winter morning. Vault 15B houses Margaret Henley, who died in 1923 at the age of 47. The records show she was the daughter-in-law of the family patriarch, married to his youngest son Thomas. Nothing unusual about her interment, no special circumstances or family requests. Just another member of the Henley family, taking her place in the elaborate monument they'd built to house their legacy. I made a note to check the vault seal during my next maintenance round. Condensation usually means temperature differences or humidity problems, and either could damage the interior. But when I examined Vault 15B that afternoon, everything looked normal. The seal was intact, the glass was clear, and the interior temperature matched the rest of the building. I tested the heating system, checked the humidity controls, even brought in our HVAC contractor to examine the ventilation. Everything was functioning perfectly. But the next night, the infrared footage showed the same pattern. Condensation forming and fading on the inside of vault door 15B, rhythmic and consistent, lasting from just after 2 a.m. until almost 4. I watched the playback several times, timing the intervals. The cloudy patches appeared every 4 to 6 seconds, held for about 2 seconds, then faded completely before starting again, like breathing. Deep, slow, patient breathing. I started checking the footage every morning, telling myself I was documenting a maintenance issue that needed to be solved. The pattern was absolutely consistent every night. Same vault, same time frame, same rhythmic condensation, but only on the infrared camera. The regular security camera showed nothing unusual, just the dark interior of the mausoleum, with its rows of vault doors catching the dim light from the exit signs. The troubling part was how the pattern stopped. Not gradually, not with any kind of natural fade, but instantly, the moment anyone entered the building. I discovered this accidentally when Robert Chen, our night security guard, made an unscheduled patrol through the mausoleum at 2:38 a.m. The timestamp on the infrared footage showed the condensation pattern cutting off at exactly 2:37:34 seconds right, when Robert's flashlight beam first appeared in the doorway. I asked Robert if he'd noticed anything unusual during that patrol. He said the mausoleum felt colder than normal, and he'd heard what might have been settling sounds from the structure, but nothing he considered worth reporting. Old buildings make noise, especially limestone construction in fluctuating temperatures. But when I pressed him about the specific area around Vault 15B, he paused. Felt different over there, he said. Can't explain it better than that. Just different. I started staying late on Thursday nights, telling myself I was working on quarterly reports that needed quiet time to complete properly. Really, I was positioning myself to monitor the mausoleum during those early morning hours when the strange pattern appeared. I set up in my office with a clear view of the building and access to the live security feeds. If something was causing condensation inside Vault 15B, I wanted to understand what it was. The first Thursday I stayed late, I watched the infrared feed from my office computer. At 2:07 a.m., the pattern began exactly as it had every night before. Condensation forming and fading on the inside surface of Vault Door 15B, steady and rhythmic like controlled breathing. I grabbed my flashlight and walked quickly across the grounds to the mausoleum entrance. The moment I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the condensation stopped. I checked my phone to 11 a.m., well within the time frame when the pattern should have been continuing. But when I called back to my office and had my assistant check the live feed, the infrared camera showed nothing unusual, just the static interior of the building, dark and silent. I spent 40 minutes inside the mausoleum that night, examining every inch of Vault 15B and the surrounding area. The interior temperature was exactly 68 degrees, same as the rest of the building. No drafts, no humidity variations, no signs of structural problems. But standing directly in front of Margaret Henley's vault, I felt what Robert had described, something different. Not colder or warmer, not any physical sensation I could name, just the unsettling awareness that I wasn't alone in the way I should have been alone. When I returned to my office and checked the footage, the condensation pattern had resumed at 2:43 a.m., exactly 4 minutes after I locked the mausoleum door behind me. This became my Thursday night routine through November and into December. I'd position myself to watch the infrared feed, see the pattern begin, walk to the mausoleum, and witness it stop the moment I entered. Every time, without exception. The condensation would resume within minutes of my leaving, continuing until just before 4 a.m. I started bringing a digital thermometer, a humidity gauge, even a small voice recorder to document any sounds I might be missing. The readings were always normal. The recordings captured nothing but my own footsteps and breathing, occasionally the settling sounds that old buildings make. But the feeling of presence grew stronger each visit, until I found myself speaking quietly to the space around Vault 15B, acknowledging whatever was there without expecting any response. "I'm just checking on things," I'd say, standing in front of Margaret Henley's vault, making sure everything's as it should be. The feeling wasn't threatening, exactly. More like being watched by someone who was curious rather than hostile, someone who was waiting for something I couldn't provide. I started researching Margaret Henley's life, thinking there might be some detail in her history that would explain why her rest seemed less peaceful than her family members. But the records were sparse. Born Margaret Walsh in 1876, married Thomas Henley in 1898, died of influenza in 1923. Mother of 2 daughters who died in childhood, devoted member of St. Anthony's Catholic Church, active in local charitable organizations. Nothing unusual, nothing tragic beyond the ordinary losses that mark so many lives in that era. But I did find one detail that stayed with me. According to her obituary in the local newspaper, Margaret Henley had suffered from severe asthma throughout her adult life. The condition had worsened significantly in her final years, leaving her frequently short of breath and dependent on family members for basic care. She died during the influenza outbreak that swept through our county in the winter of 1923, her compromised respiratory system unable to fight off the infection. Someone who had struggled to breathe for years, who died gasping for air she couldn't take. Someone whose last months were defined by the desperate need for breath that wouldn't come. The night I made that connection was a Thursday in mid-December, cold enough that my breath fogged in the air as I walked from the administration building to the mausoleum. I'd been watching the infrared feed for almost an hour, seeing the familiar pattern of condensation forming and fading on vault door 15B. But this time, instead of walking over to interrupt it, I decided to stay and observe. I sat in my office chair, watching the infrared monitor, timing the intervals between each appearance of condensation. 4 seconds, fade. 5 seconds, fade. 4 seconds, fade. Steady and patient, like someone finally able to breathe deeply after years of struggling for air, like someone savoring each breath they'd been denied in life. At 3:28 a.m., the pattern changed. Instead of the steady rhythm I'd grown accustomed to, the condensation began forming more rapidly, the intervals shortening to 2 seconds, then 1 second, then overlapping until the entire inside surface of vault door 15B was fogged with moisture. Through the infrared camera, it looked like someone was breathing heavily against the glass, their breath coming faster and more desperately. I was reaching for my phone to call security when the pattern stopped completely. Not the gradual fade I'd seen before, but an immediate cessation that left the vault door clear and still. The timestamp read 3:29:14 seconds, exactly the moment when Margaret Henley had died, according to the death certificate I'd found in our historical records. 3:29 a.m. on December 15th, 1923. I never stayed late on Thursday nights after that. The breathing pattern continued. I checked the morning footage regularly to confirm it, but I no longer felt the need to interrupt or investigate. Some forms of rest, I realized, are more active than sleep. Some people need to practice in death what they couldn't do properly in life. The condensation still appears on vault door 15B every night between 2 and 4 a.m., visible only on the infrared cameras, stopping instantly if anyone enters the mausoleum. I've come to think of it as Margaret Henley's time, her opportunity to breathe as deeply and freely as she wants, without the constraints of failing lungs or struggling airways. I still make my regular maintenance rounds through the mausoleum, still ensure that everything is clean and properly maintained for the families who visit. But I no longer check the building during those early morning hours. Some kinds of peace shouldn't be disturbed, even by good intentions. And some breathing, I've learned, is too precious to interrupt. Some kinds of love are so particular that death can't change their habits, only redirect their attention. I'm Patricia Wells, and I've been directing funeral services at Oakwood Memorial for 16 years. Started fresh out of mortuary science school with idealistic notions about providing comfort to grieving families. And while the reality has been more complex than I expected, the core purpose remains meaningful. Every day brings families who are navigating the worst moments of their lives, and my job is to help them honor their loved ones with dignity and grace. It's demanding work that requires equal parts compassion and professionalism, the ability to guide people through decisions they never wanted to make while managing the practical details that death requires. Oakwood Memorial sits on 12 acres of landscaped grounds, with the main chapel overlooking a series of garden sections where we conduct graveside services. My office is on the second floor of the chapel building, with windows that provide a clear view of the cemetery's central areas. It's a peaceful vista, most of the time families visiting graves, groundskeepers maintaining the landscape, the quiet rhythm of people tending to memory and loss. Over the years, I've become familiar with the regular visitors, the people who come weekly or monthly to leave flowers, sit quietly, or simply stand near the graves of those they've lost. Mrs. Lily Chen became one of those regulars after we buried her husband David in late March of 2022. David had been 83, a retired engineer who'd worked for the State Transportation Department for 40 years. The service was small but heartfelt. David and Lily had been married for 57 years, but they'd outlived most of their contemporaries and had no children. It was mainly Lily, a few neighbors, and some colleagues from David's engineering days. Lily herself was a slight woman in her late 70s, soft-spoken but clearly capable, the kind of person who'd spent decades managing household details with quiet efficiency. What I noticed first about Lily's visits was their regularity. Every Wednesday at 2 p.m., she'd arrive in her blue Honda Civic, carrying a small arrangement of flowers to David's grave. Nothing elaborate usually, a modest bouquet from the grocery store or flowers she'd cut from her own garden. She'd spend about 30 minutes at the gravesite, sometimes sitting on the small bench we'd installed nearby, sometimes kneeling to arrange the flowers or pull weeds from around the headstone. From my office window, I could see her moving with deliberate care, taking time to ensure everything looked exactly as she wanted it. The flowers she brought were always mixed arrangements, roses, carnations, baby's breath, whatever was available or in season. Nothing wrong with that, but the arrangements were clearly amateur work, the kind of casual bouquet someone assembles at home without formal training in floral design. Lily would spend considerable time at David's grave, repositioning the flowers, adjusting stems, trying to create something visually pleasing but never quite achieving the balanced look of professional arrangements. I started noticing the changes about 6 weeks after David's burial. I'd watch Lily complete her visit and drive away, leaving her flowers arranged as best she could manage on David's grave. But if I looked out my window an hour or two later, the bouquet would appear different, more organized somehow, with better color balance and more thoughtful positioning of the different flower types. The stems would be arranged at more aesthetically pleasing angles, creating depth and visual interest that hadn't been there when Lily left. At first, I assumed our groundskeeping staff was making adjustments. We employ several people who take pride in maintaining the cemetery's appearance, and it wouldn't be unusual for someone to tidy up flower arrangements that looked unsteady or poorly positioned. But when I asked Tom Rodriguez, our head groundskeeper, he said his crew had standing instructions not to disturb family flower arrangements unless they were clearly wilted or creating maintenance problems. "We don't touch the fresh flowers unless they're blocking, mowing, or causing drainage issues," Tom told me. "Families get upset if they think we're interfering with their tributes." That left me with a mystery I couldn't easily explain. Every Wednesday, Lily would leave her well-intentioned but amateur flower arrangement, and within a few hours, it would transform into something more polished and visually appealing. The same flowers, the same vase or container, but arranged with what looked like professional skill and artistic sensibility. I started paying closer attention to the timing. Lily's visits were consistently 30 to 40 minutes long, and she always left by 2:45 p.m. at the latest. The flower rearrangement seemed to happen between 3 and 4 p.m., during a period when the cemetery was usually quiet. and I rarely saw anyone moving through that section. I began checking my window more frequently during that time frame, trying to catch someone in the act of adjusting Lily's arrangements. But I never saw anyone near David's grave during those afternoon hours. The cemetery would be empty except for the occasional visitor in a different section, yet the flowers would gradually shift into new configurations that were noticeably more attractive than what Lily had created. It happened every week, without exception, and always with the same improvement in aesthetic appeal. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday in early June when I decided to observe more systematically. I positioned myself at my office window with a cup of coffee and my afternoon paperwork, keeping David's grave in my peripheral vision while working on other tasks. Lily arrived at her usual time, spent her usual 30 minutes arranging flowers and tending to the grave, then departed in her blue Honda Civic. At 3:15 p.m., I watched the flowers begin to move. Not dramatically, not with obvious supernatural fanfare, but with subtle shifts that were clearly visible once I knew to look for them. A stem would rotate slightly, creating better visual balance. A flower head would tilt to catch afternoon light more effectively. Gradually, over the course of about 20 minutes, the entire arrangement reorganized itself into something more harmonious and professionally presented. There was no wind that afternoon strong enough to cause such deliberate movement, and no one visible anywhere near David's grave. Just the flowers slowly adjusting themselves while I watched from my office window, too fascinated to be frightened. The next Wednesday, I made a point of greeting Lily when she arrived for her visit. We'd spoken briefly during the funeral arrangements, but I'd given her space during her weekly visits, out of respect for her private grieving time. This time, I walked out to David's grave while she was arranging her flowers. "Those are beautiful," I said, gesturing to the mixed bouquet of yellow roses and white carnations she was positioning around the headstone. "Thank you," Lily replied, adjusting a carnation stem with careful fingers. "I'm not very good at this, but I try to make them look nice for him." "I'm sure he appreciates the effort," I said, then decided to broach the subject gently. "I've noticed from my office that your arrangements always look particularly lovely when I see them later in the day." Lily paused in her flower positioning and looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not surprised exactly, but perhaps relieved that someone else had noticed what she'd been experiencing. "Have you seen them change?" she asked quietly. "I have," I admitted. "The flowers seem to rearrange themselves into more polished presentations after you leave." Lily smiled then, a gentle expression that held decades of shared life and mutual understanding. "He always was particular about how things looked," she said, returning her attention to the flowers. 57 years of him straightening picture frames and rearranging furniture until everything was just so. I suppose some habits don't change. She said it so matter-of-factly, with such acceptance, that the supernatural element felt perfectly natural. Of course, David was still particular about appearances. Of course, he would take the flowers his wife brought with love and arrange them according to his own aesthetic standards. It wasn't frightening or disturbing, it was simply the continuation of a personality trait that had defined him throughout their marriage. "Does it bother you?" I asked. "Oh no," Lily said, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. "It's actually quite comforting. I was never very artistic, and he always had a better eye for these things. I bring what I can, and he makes them beautiful. It's like we're still taking care of things together." From that day forward, I watched Lily's Wednesday visits with new understanding. She would arrive with her grocery store flowers or garden cuttings, arrange them as best she could, spend time talking quietly to David's headstone, then leave knowing that her efforts would be improved by someone who'd spent a lifetime perfecting the art of making things look just right. The rearrangement continued every week, always during that quiet afternoon period when the cemetery was nearly empty. I stopped questioning the mechanics of how it happened and simply accepted it as part of the ongoing relationship between Lily and David, a marriage that had found new ways to express familiar patterns of care and cooperation. Sometimes I would see Lily examining David's grave when she arrived for her next visit, noting how her previous week's flowers had been transformed into something more beautiful than she'd been able to create alone. Her smile during those moments was one of pure contentment, the expression of someone whose love was still being actively reciprocated even across the boundary between life and death. Other families began to notice David's consistently beautiful flower arrangements, and several asked me for recommendations about florists or professional services they might hire for their own loved ones' graves. I would simply tell them that some people have a natural talent for creating beauty, leaving it at that. Lily continued her Wednesday visits through the summer and into fall, always bringing flowers, always having them transformed into something more aesthetically pleasing within hours of her departure. The partnership that had sustained their marriage for 57 years had found a new expression, one that honored both Lily's devotion and David's particular eye for visual harmony. I still watch from my office window sometimes, though I no longer feel the need to document or understand exactly how the flower rearrangement happens. Some forms of love are so deeply ingrained that death becomes just another circumstance to adapt to, not an ending but a different way of caring for each other across whatever distance separates them. The arrangements at David's grave remain the most consistently beautiful in our cemetery, and Lily's Wednesday visits continue with the same quiet satisfaction of someone whose efforts are still being appreciated and improved by the person who knew her best. In a profession where I witness the finality of death every day, their ongoing collaboration serves as a reminder that some connections are too particular, too essential, to be severed by something as ordinary as dying. Some voices carry further in the dark than they ever did in daylight, and some calls demand answers you're not ready to give. I'm Roy Hutchins, and I've worked the night shift at Willow Creek Cemetery for 12 years. Started when I was 28, needed steady work after my construction job ended, and figured cemetery maintenance would be quiet, simple labor. Turn out to be right about the quiet part, mostly. Night groundskeeping means checking the gates, maintaining the pathways, making sure everything's secure for the families who'll visit during normal hours. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. Always been better with my own company than dealing with crowds or complicated social situations. Willow Creek covers 37 acres on the outskirts of town, with burial sections dating back to the 1860s. The older sections are laid out in traditional rows marked with letters and number section A through section K, with rows numbered 1 through 15 in each section. Row 9C sits about halfway through the cemetery, in a grove of willow trees that gives the place its name. Pretty spot during the day, peaceful and shaded. At night, with just my flashlight cutting through the darkness between the headstones, it feels more isolated. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 8 hours of walking predetermined routes, checking locks, clearing debris that might accumulate during the day. I've got a small maintenance shed where I keep equipment and take breaks, but most of the time I'm moving through the grounds. You develop routines in work like this, patterns that become as automatic as breathing. I start with the perimeter fence, check the main gate and the service entrances, then work my way through the sections in alphabetical order. Section A, Section B, Section C, and so on until I've covered everything. Takes about 2 hours for a complete circuit, which means I make the rounds 3 or 4 times per shift. The walking gives you time to think, maybe too much time. I've always been someone who keeps his thoughts to himself. Never been much for talking through problems or sharing personal details with coworkers. My family situation is complicated. Grew up with a father who left when I was 15. Never heard from him again. Never really wanted to. Mother raised me and my younger sister on her own after that. Did a good job considering the circumstances. When she passed in 2006, it was just me and Sarah, and we've kept in touch but not close. Some families stay tight through everything. Others just drift apart, even when there's no hard feelings involved. I'd been working at Willow Creek for about 8 months when I started hearing my name called during the night rounds. At first, I thought it might be other workers. We've got a small night crew that handles different parts of the operation, but the voice was coming from sections where no one else had any reason to be. Just my name, Roy, spoken clearly enough to make me stop walking and listen. always seemed to come from the direction of row 9C, somewhere in that grove of willows where the older headstones clustered together under the drooping branches. The first few times it happened, I figured it was wind moving through the trees, or maybe sound carrying strangely across the cemetery from the road. You hear things differently in the quiet of night shift work, and cemeteries have acoustics that can make normal sounds seem like they're coming from unexpected directions. But the voice was distinct enough to make me pause each time, distinct enough that I'd walk toward row 9C with my flashlight to check if someone needed help or had gotten lost among the graves. Never found anyone. Just the familiar headstones and monuments, the willow branches moving slightly in whatever breeze was stirring that night. But the voice continued, maybe once or twice a week, always during my rounds through Section C, always my name, always from the same general direction. And gradually, I started to recognize something familiar about it. It sounded like my father. Not exactly like him, I hadn't heard his voice in 17 years, and memory plays tricks with details like that. But there was something in the tone, the way the syllables were shaped, that reminded me of how he used to call me in from playing outside when I was a kid. Patient but with an edge of authority, like he expected to be heard and answered. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite name, this echo of a voice I'd spent years trying to forget. I started changing my route through Section C, taking paths that avoided row 9C when possible. But cemetery maintenance requires thoroughness, and there are specific areas that need to be checked every night for security reasons. I couldn't skip an entire section just because I was hearing things that reminded me of family I'd rather not think about. So I'd walk through row 9C quickly, flashlight sweeping across the headstones, trying not to listen too carefully to the sounds around me. But the voice persisted. Roy. Sometimes it seemed to come from deeper in the grove, sometimes from just ahead of me on the path. Always clear enough to make me stop, always gone by the time I turned my flashlight toward the source. And always in that tone I remembered from childhood, patient and expectant, like someone waiting for me to respond. After 6 months of this, I decided to check the burial records. Willow Creek keeps detailed files going back to the cemetery's founding, and I'd learned to navigate the system during my training when I needed to help visitors find specific graves. If someone was buried in row 9C, whose voice might be familiar to me, maybe a family friend I'd forgotten about, or some distant relative, I wanted to understand why my subconscious might be making that connection. The records for row 9C showed the usual mix of burials spanning several decades. Farmers, shopkeepers, a few families that had been prominent in the area during the early 1900s. I went through each entry, looking for names I might recognize, people who might have known my family or had some connection to my childhood. Nothing stood out. Most of the burials were from before I was born, and the names meant nothing to me. Then I found the entry that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the computer screen for a long time. Hutchins, Carl Raymond, buried in row 9C, plot 12, death date, March 15, 2007, 3 months before I started working at Willow Creek. My father, buried in the same section where I'd been hearing his voice call my name for the past year. I'd never been notified of his death, never been contacted about burial arrangements or final services. According to the records, the arrangements had been made by Sarami's sister, had known where he was, had handled everything, and had never told me. The burial was simple, just a basic headstone with his name and dates. No service listed, no family information beyond Sarah's name as the contact for the arrangements. I sat in the cemetery office for an hour that night, trying to process what I'd discovered. My father had been dead for 5 years, buried less than 200 yards from where I walked every night, and I'd never known. Sarah had made a decision to handle his death without involving me, probably thinking it would be easier that way given our family history. And maybe she was right. I'd spent 17 years not wanting to know where he was or what had happened to him, so why would his death be any different? But it was different. Knowing he was there, knowing I'd been walking past his grave 4 nights a week for years, changed something about the night rounds. The voice calling my name took on a weight it hadn't had before. It wasn't just my imagination, or some trick of acoustics. It was a specific person trying to get my attention, trying to make contact across whatever distance separates the living from the dead. I started walking through row 9C more deliberately, taking time to read the headstones, getting familiar with the layout of that section. Carl Raymond Hutchins was buried under a simple granite marker about halfway through the row, surrounded by graves from roughly the same time period. The headstone gave his birth year as 1946 and his death as 2007, with no epitaph or personal message, just the basic facts of a life that had lasted 61 years. Standing in front of his grave for the first time, I didn't feel the overwhelming emotion I might have expected. No sudden rush of grief or anger or forgiveness, just a quiet recognition that this was where he'd ended up, this plot of ground under the willow trees in a cemetery where I happened to work. It felt less like a reunion than like solving a puzzle I hadn't known I was working on. But the voice calling my name became more frequent after that, and more insistent. Not louder, but somehow more urgent, like someone trying to get my attention for something important. I'd hear it during every shift now, sometimes multiple times as I walked through Section C, always from the direction of row 9C, always in that patient but expectant tone I remembered from childhood. I started responding, not out loud, but in my head, acknowledging that I heard him calling my name. The strange thing was that it seemed to help. The voice would call, "Roy." I'd think back, "I hear you," and there would be a moment of quiet that felt less like silence than like satisfaction. Like someone who'd been trying to get my attention had finally succeeded. This went on for several months, becoming part of my normal routine. Walk through Section C, hear my father's voice calling my name, acknowledge that I heard him, continue with the rounds. It should have been disturbing, but instead it felt oddly comfortable, like we'd found a way to coexist in the same space, without the complications that had driven us apart when he was alive. The night that changed was a Thursday in late November, cold enough that my breath fogged in the flashlight beam as I walked through the cemetery. I was making my usual round through Section C when I heard the voice again, but this time it was different. Instead of just "Roy," I heard, "Roy, come here." I stopped walking. In all the months I'd been hearing my father's voice, he'd never said anything except my name. The additional words made it feel more like an actual conversation, more like he was trying to communicate something specific rather than just making contact. I walked toward row 9C, following the path between the headstones, until I reached his grave. The willow branches were bare for winter, creating a canopy of thin shadows in the flashlight beam. I stood at the foot of his grave and waited, not sure what I was waiting for, but feeling like something was expected of me. "I'm here," I said quietly, speaking out loud for the first time since this all started. The response wasn't a voice this time, but a feeling, a sense of presence that was unmistakably warm, unmistakably familiar, unmistakably paternal. Like being acknowledged by someone who'd been watching over me for years without my knowing it. Like being forgiven for anger I'd carried too long, and being asked to forgive in return. I stayed there for maybe 10 minutes, just standing by his grave in the cold November night, feeling more connected to my father than I had since I was 15 years old. When I finally continued my rounds, the cemetery felt different, not haunted, but inhabited by presences that were protective rather than troubling. I still hear his voice calling my name during the night shifts, maybe once or twice a week. But now it feels less like an interruption and more like a check-in, like someone making sure I'm okay as I walk through the darkness between the headstones. Sometimes I stop by his grave during my rounds, just to acknowledge that I know he's there, that I'm grateful for the connection we've found in this place where both of us ended up by accident. The work is still solitary, still quiet, still simple maintenance in the hours when most people are sleeping, but I'm not alone in the way I used to be alone. Some voices carry further in the dark than they ever did in daylight, and some calls, once you answer them, become conversations that continue longer than you'd ever expect. Row 9C feels different, now not like a section I have to check, but like a place where someone is waiting to hear from me, someone who's been patient enough to call my name for years until I was ready to respond. Some graves refuse to be forgotten, no matter how alone their occupants died or how many decades pass without visitors. I'm Danny Kowalski, and I've worked grounds maintenance at Riverside Cemetery for 9 years. Started right out of high school when I needed steady work and didn't mind physical labor. Figured I'd stay a year or two before moving on to something else. Turned out I liked the work more than I expected. The quiet rhythm of maintaining the grounds, the satisfaction of keeping a place beautiful for families who come to remember their loved ones. There's purpose in this job that goes beyond just cutting grass and trimming hedges, though those are certainly part of it. Riverside covers 42 acres on the east side of town, with sections dating back to the 1870s. The older sections are where I spend most of my time, since the newer areas are easier to maintain with modern equipment and standardized layouts. The old sections have character, but require more attention: uneven terrain, mature trees that drop leaves and branches, headstones that have settled or shifted over the decades. It's detail work that takes patience and care, making sure every grave looks tended and respected, regardless of how often family members visit. I work the morning shift, starting at 6 a.m. when the gates unlock and ending around 2 p.m. when the afternoon crew takes over. Early morning is the best time for this work. The air is cool, the cemetery is quiet, and you can accomplish a lot before the heat builds up or visitors start arriving. I've got a routine that covers different sections on different days, ensuring that every part of Riverside gets regular attention. Monday is sections A through D, Tuesday is E through H, and so on through the week. Plot 847 sits in section F, about halfway up a gentle slope that overlooks the older part of the cemetery. It's a modest grave marked with a simple limestone headstone that reads, Sarah Milliken, 1892 to 1923. No epitaph, no decorative carving, just the basic information carved in straightforward letters. According to the cemetery records, Sarah was buried alone with no service listed, no family contacts noted, just the minimum arrangement for someone who died without people to make more elaborate plans. I first noticed the flowers on a Tuesday morning in late April. Fresh roses arranged in a small glass vase beside Sarah's headstone. Deep red blooms that looked like they'd been cut that morning. Nothing unusual about flowers on graves. Families leave tributes all the time, but these roses caught my attention because they were clearly expensive varieties, the kind you'd get from a high-end florist rather than a grocery store or home garden. What struck me as odd was the timing. I always start my Section F rounds at Sarah's grave because it's positioned near the access road, and I'd never seen flowers there before. The roses looked professionally arranged, with baby's breath and greenery that suggested someone had taken considerable care in creating the tribute. But there was no note, no indication of who might have left them or why they'd chosen that particular grave. I assumed it was a case of mistaken identity. Someone had meant to leave flowers at a nearby grave and gotten confused about the exact location. It happens occasionally, especially in sections where the headstones are similar or the plots are close together. I made a note to check the surrounding graves during my next round to see if anyone seemed to be missing their intended tribute. But the next morning, there were fresh flowers on Sarah's grave again. Different roses, this time yellow instead of red, but the same professional quality and careful arrangement. The previous day's red roses were gone completely, not wilted or discarded, but simply absent, as if they'd never been there at all. I started paying closer attention to plot 847 during my daily rounds. Every morning brought fresh flowers, always roses, always beautifully arranged, always in that same small glass vase that never seemed to accumulate dust or show wear despite being outdoors. The colors varied: yellow, white, pink, but the quality remained consistently high, the kind of roses that cost serious money at any florist in town. The mystery deepened when I realized the flowers appeared despite security measures that should have prevented unauthorized access. Riverside locks its gates at sunset and doesn't reopen until 6 a.m. when I arrive for work. The cemetery is surrounded by chain-link fencing that's in good repair, and we've never had problems with people climbing over or cutting through to access the grounds after hours. Yet every morning brought fresh flowers to Sarah's grave, deposited sometime during the night when no one should have been able to enter the cemetery. I started checking with Tom Brennan, our night security guard, to see if he'd noticed anyone near Section F during his rounds. Tom walks the perimeter twice per shift and drives through the main sections once around midnight, but he'd never seen anyone in the area where Sarah's grave is located. The flowers were simply appearing without any visible explanation for how they got there. What bothered me more than the security question was the type of roses being left. I've lived in this area my entire life, and I know what grows in local gardens and what's available at nearby florists. The roses on Sarah's grave were varieties I'd never seen before: exotic colors, unusual petal formations, fragrances that didn't match anything in the standard gardening catalogs. Some mornings the roses were deep purple, almost black. Other days they were cream-colored with pink edges, or orange with red streaks, combinations that looked like they belonged in botanical gardens rather than rural cemeteries. I decided to research Sarah Milliken's background, thinking there might be some detail about her life that would explain the ongoing tributes. The cemetery keeps basic records, but for someone buried in 1923, the information is sparse. Sarah was 31 when she died, unmarried according to the burial documents, with no family listed as contacts for the arrangements. The cause of death was listed as influenza, part of the outbreak that swept through our area in the early 1920s. A trip to the local historical society provided a few more details. Sarah had worked as a seamstress in town, living in a boarding house on what's now Main Street. She was described in one newspaper mention as a quiet woman who kept to herself, and her obituary was brief enough to suggest she'd made little impact on the community during her short life. There was no mention of romantic relationships, close friendships, or anyone who might have felt compelled to tend her grave with such elaborate floral tributes. But I did find one detail that stayed with me. According to a brief article about local businesses, Sarah had been known for her flower gardens. Despite living in a boarding house with limited space, she'd maintained window boxes and small garden plots that were considered among the most beautiful in town. The article mentioned her particular skill with roses, her ability to coax unusual varieties into blooming in conditions where other gardeners failed. The flowers on her grave began to feel less random after that discovery. Someone who'd spent her life creating beauty with roses was receiving roses in death, exotic varieties that matched her apparent skill and passion for gardening. But who was providing them, and how were they accessing a locked cemetery night after night? I started arriving at work earlier, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the flowers. 6 a.m. became 5:45, then 5:30, then 5:15. But no matter how early I arrived, the flowers were already there, fresh and perfectly arranged, with dew on the petals that suggested they'd been placed just before dawn. The dew itself became another puzzle. We'd been experiencing an unusually dry spring, with no measurable rainfall for over 3 weeks, and humidity levels that rarely rose above 40%. Yet the roses on Sarah's grave were consistently covered with heavy dew, droplets that caught the early morning light, like they'd been placed outside during a heavy fog. The surrounding grass and headstones showed no sign of moisture, just the roses and their glass vase beaded with water that shouldn't have formed under such dry conditions. I decided to stake out the cemetery one Thursday night, positioning myself in my truck across the street with a clear view of Section F. If someone was accessing the grounds after hours, I wanted to understand how they were managing it and why they'd chosen Sarah's grave for their elaborate tribute routine. The night was clear and still, with enough moonlight to see the general layout of the cemetery without requiring artificial illumination. I settled in with coffee and a thermos, prepared to wait until dawn if necessary to solve the mystery of Plot 847. At 3:23 a.m., I saw movement near Sarah's grave. Not a person walking or climbing over the fence, but something more subtle. A shifting of shadows that didn't correspond to any wind or cloud movement. A gentle disturbance in the area around Plot 847 that was barely visible in the moonlight. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the spot where Sarah's headstone stood. A figure was kneeling beside the grave, though I couldn't make out specific details even with the binoculars. The person appeared to be arranging flowers, moving with careful deliberation around the headstone. But there was something dreamlike about the movements, a flowing quality that didn't quite match normal human gestures. The figure seemed to fade in and out of visibility, sometimes clear enough to observe, sometimes barely distinguishable from the shadows cast by nearby trees. I watched for about 10 minutes as the figure tended to Sarah's grave with what appeared to be deep familiarity and care. Then, without any dramatic departure or obvious movement away from the grave, the figure simply wasn't there anymore. Not walking away, not disappearing behind trees or headstones, just absent where moments before someone had been arranging flowers. I waited until dawn before entering the cemetery, my hands shaking slightly as I unlocked the main gate. The walk to Section F felt longer than usual, though I wasn't sure what I expected to find when I reached Plot 847. The flowers were there as they'd been every morning for weeks, fresh roses in impossible colors, arranged in the small glass vase with dew-covered petals that sparkled in the early light. But this time, I noticed something else. The earth around Sarah's headstone looked recently disturbed, not by digging, but by careful tending, as if someone had been pulling weeds and smoothing soil with loving attention to detail. I knelt beside the grave and touched the dew on one of the roses. The water was real, cold against my fingertips, though the surrounding ground remained bone dry. The roses themselves were unlike anything I'd seen in catalogs or nurseries' deep burgundy petals with silver edges, a combination that seemed to shift color as the morning light changed angles. Standing there in the quiet cemetery, surrounded by evidence of care that defied logical explanation, I felt the presence of something that transcended the usual boundaries between life and death. Sarah Milliken, who died alone in 1923, was receiving the kind of devoted attention that spoke of deep love and permanent commitment. Whether from someone who'd known her in life or some force that recognized the beauty she'd created with flowers during her brief time on Earth, her grave had become a canvas for ongoing tribute. I never attempted another late-night stakeout, and I stopped questioning the logistics of how exotic roses appeared daily in a locked cemetery. Some forms of devotion operate by rules I don't understand, and some people continue to receive love long after the world assumes they've been forgotten. The flowers still appear every morning on Plot 847, and I've learned to appreciate them as part of the cemetery's landscape rather than a mystery to be solved. Sarah Milliken may have lived quietly and died alone, but her grave suggests that solitude in life doesn't necessarily mean abandonment in death. Some gardens, it seems, continue to bloom long after their gardeners have gone to rest. There are places in the earth that remember trauma, and sometimes that memory has weight enough to crush the living. I'm Frank Torres, and I've been cemetery maintenance chief at Sacred Heart Memorial for 14 years. Started as a groundskeeper straight out of the Army, worked my way up through equipment operation and landscaping to supervising a crew of 8 people who maintained 63 acres of burial grounds. It's honest work that requires attention to detail and respect for the families who trust us to care for their loved ones' final resting places. Over the years, I've learned that cemetery maintenance is as much about preserving dignity as it is about cutting grass and maintaining pathways. Sacred Heart dates back to 1907, with sections that range from simple headstone plots to elaborate family mausoleums. My crew handles everything from routine mowing and hedge trimming to grave preparation, headstone cleaning, and seasonal decorating. We work year-round, maintaining the grounds, ensuring that every section meets the standards families expect when they come to visit and remember. It's physically demanding work, especially during summer months when the grass grows fast and the heat makes outdoor labor challenging. The crew I supervise includes guys who've been doing this work for decades and newer employees who are still learning the particular requirements of cemetery maintenance. Jesus Morales has worked here for 22 years and knows every section better than anyone. Mike Patterson handles our heavy equipment and has been with us for 8 years. Tommy Chen and David Kowalski are newer additions, but experienced landscapers who understand the precision this work requires. We've got a good team that takes pride in keeping Sacred Heart looking respectful and well-maintained. What I noticed first was the way Jesus started avoiding certain areas during his rounds. He'd been assigned to Section M for years, responsible for mowing and general maintenance of plots 100 through 200. But in late spring, he began asking to trade assignments or finding reasons to work other sections. When I pressed him about it, he mentioned that Section M felt different lately, though he couldn't explain exactly what he meant. It's like walking through mud, Jesus told me one Thursday morning, but the ground's not soft. Just feels like everything's harder to move through over there. I assumed he was dealing with equipment problems, or maybe some drainage issues from the wet spring we'd been having. Section M sits on slightly lower ground than the surrounding areas, and heavy rain can sometimes create soggy conditions that make mowing difficult. But when I checked the area myself, the ground was firm and dry, with no obvious maintenance problems that would explain Jesus' reluctance to work there. The pattern became clearer when Mike Patterson mentioned similar experiences in Section K. He'd been using the riding mower to cut grass around plots 50 through 75 when he noticed the machine seemed to require more effort to operate in certain areas. Not mechanical problems, she'd checked the engine and blade assembly, but increased resistance that made the mower feel like it was working uphill even on level ground. Feels like the earth's pushing back, Mike said, which sounded strange until I experienced it myself. I started walking the sections where my crew was reporting problems, trying to identify what might be causing their complaints. Section M felt normal at first, just well-maintained burial plots with established grass and mature landscaping. But when I walked across certain specific graves, I noticed what Jesus had described. Not sinking or instability, but a sensation of increased weight, like each step required more effort than it should. The feeling was subtle but unmistakable once I knew to pay attention for it. The graves that felt different shared one characteristic that became obvious once I started checking burial records. They were all people who had died suddenly: car accidents, heart attacks, workplace injuries, medical emergencies that gave families no time to prepare for loss. The graves of people who died after long illnesses or advanced age felt normal underfoot. Only the sudden deaths created that sensation of heaviness, that resistance that made walking across their plots feel like moving through an invisible substance denser than air. Tommy Chen was the first to describe the feeling as weight bearing down from above rather than resistance from below. He'd been trimming around headstones in Section L when he felt what he described as pressure settling on his shoulders and chest, making it difficult to breathe normally. The sensation was strongest directly over certain grave sites and faded as he moved away from them. Like Jesus and Mike, Tommy found that the affected graves were all sudden deaths, people who had died without warning, leaving families to grapple with shock and unprocessed grief. The weight became something my entire crew learned to recognize and work around. We'd identify the affected graves during planning meetings and adjust assignments accordingly, making sure no one spent extended time working directly over those plots. The sensation wasn't dangerous exactly, but it was exhausting in a way that went beyond normal physical fatigue. Guys would come off shifts feeling drained, like they'd been carrying heavy loads all day even when their actual work had been routine maintenance. I started experiencing the weight myself during my supervisory rounds, particularly in sections where we had recent burials of sudden deaths. A 23-year-old who died in a motorcycle accident. A 45-year-old father who had a massive heart attack while coaching his son's baseball game. A 38-year-old mother killed by a drunk driver on her way home from work. Standing near their graves created a pressure that seemed to settle on my chest and shoulders, making normal breathing feel labored and difficult. The weight wasn't just physical, though that's how it manifested most obviously. There was an emotional component too, a crushing sadness that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Standing over these graves, I'd find myself thinking about the families left behind, the conversations that would never happen, the futures that ended without warning. It was grief made tangible, sorrow with enough substance to be felt as actual pressure against the body. What disturbed me most was how the weight followed me home. After working near the affected graves, I'd find myself lying in bed feeling like something heavy was pressing down on my chest. Not sleep paralysis or anxiety attacks, I'd experienced both and knew the difference, but the same crushing sensation I felt at the cemetery, continuing hours after I'd left work. My wife Maria noticed me tossing and turning, struggling to get comfortable, but I couldn't explain what was keeping me awake without sounding like I was losing my grip on reality. The crew started comparing notes about their experiences, and everyone reported similar after effects. David Kowalski mentioned feeling like he was carrying invisible weight during his commute home. Mike Patterson described waking up in the middle of the night feeling pressed down by something he couldn't see or identify. Tommy Chen said his wife asked if he was getting sick because he looked tired all the time, even after full nights of sleep. We developed informal protocols for managing the situation, rotating assignments so no one worked the affected areas for consecutive days, taking frequent breaks when maintenance required extended time near the heaviest graves, scheduling the most difficult plots for times when multiple crew members could share the work and minimize individual exposure to whatever was causing the sensation. But the wait continued to intensify, particularly around graves where the deceased had left young children or where the circumstances of death were especially traumatic. A plot where a 19-year-old college student was buried after a dormitory fire, the grave of a construction worker who fell from scaffolding while his family watched from below. These sites created pressure so intense that my crew could only work near them for short periods before needing to step away and recover. I decided to research the phenomenon, thinking there might be some scientific explanation for what we were experiencing. Soil composition, underground water flow, geological factors that could create unusual physical sensations. But my searches turned up nothing that matched what we were dealing with. The weight we felt had no rational basis in physics or geology. It seemed to originate from something less tangible than earth and stone. The breakthrough came when I spoke with Father Martinez, the chaplain who conducts many of the services at Sacred Heart. I'd known him for years and trusted his discretion, so I described what my crew and I had been experiencing without expecting any particular insight. Father Martinez listened thoughtfully, then mentioned something that made the pattern clearer. Sudden death leaves grief unresolved, he said. Families don't get time to prepare, to say goodbye, to process what's happening. That kind of shock creates a different quality of mourning, more intense and lasting. Maybe what you're feeling is the weight of that unfinished business. The idea that grief itself could have physical presence seemed impossible, but it matched our experiences too closely to dismiss. The affected graves were all places where families had been forced to confront loss without preparation, where shock and disbelief were buried along with the deceased. Perhaps that combination of trauma and sorrow had somehow accumulated in the earth, creating a tangible heaviness that reflected the emotional burden carried by the living. The weight reached its peak during a service for a 7-year-old girl who died in a house fire while her parents were at work. The entire crew could feel the pressure building as we prepared the gravesite, a crushing sensation that made normal movement difficult and breathing labored. During the service itself, I watched family members struggling to stand upright, leaning on each other for support that seemed to be about more than emotional comfort. The very air around the grave felt thick and oppressive, like grief had gained enough substance to alter the physical environment. After the service, when the family had left and we were completing the burial procedures, the weight settled over the gravesite with an intensity that forced my crew to work in short shifts. Standing directly over the plot for more than a few minutes became impossible. The pressure was too great, the sensation of carrying invisible weight too exhausting to sustain. That night, the weight followed me home with unprecedented force. I lay in bed feeling like I was being pressed into the mattress by something immeasurably heavy, struggling to breathe normally while Maria slept peacefully beside me. The sensation lasted until dawn, lifting gradually as the sun rose and normal life resumed around me. I still supervise maintenance at Sacred Heart, and the weight remains a factor we have to consider in our daily operations. Certain graves require special attention and limited exposure, places where the earth itself seems to hold the accumulated pressure of sudden loss and unprocessed grief. My crew has learned to work around these areas with respect and caution, understanding that some burials create lasting effects that extend beyond the physical boundaries of plots and headstones. The weight has become part of the job, a reminder that cemetery maintenance involves more than landscaping and groundskeeping. We're caring for places where families have deposited their deepest sorrows, and sometimes that emotional burden takes on a life of its own. Some graves hold more than bodies. They hold the crushing weight of love that had no time to say goodbye, grief that settled into the earth and refuses to dissipate. I still feel the pressure following me home after difficult days, still lie awake some nights with invisible weight pressing down on my chest. But I've come to understand it as part of the responsibility that comes with this work. Some jobs require you to carry things that can't be seen or measured, burdens that become part of who you are rather than tasks you complete and leave behind. The weight of grief, I've learned, is one of those burdens, and once you've felt it settle on your shoulders, it never fully lifts. Some doors refuse to stay closed, no matter how many times you lock them or how carefully you check the mechanism. I'm Linda Vasquez, and I've worked security at Pine Ridge Cemetery for 7 years. It's not the kind of job most people think about when they consider security work. No, dealing with shoplifters or rowdy crowds. No complicated protocols for handling disturbances. Cemetery security is mostly about ensuring the grounds stay peaceful and protected, checking that gates are properly secured, monitoring for vandalism or unauthorized access after hours. It's quiet work that suits someone who prefers solitude and doesn't mind walking alone through places most people find unsettling. Pine Ridge covers 51 acres on the outskirts of town, with burial sections dating back to the 1880s. The cemetery has 7 entrance gates positioned around the perimeter, though only the main gate sees regular traffic during visiting hours. Gates 2 through 7 are service entrances used by maintenance crews and funeral processions, kept locked except when specifically needed for cemetery operations. My job involves checking all 7 gates twice per shiftance at the beginning of my rounds and again before I leave at 7 a.m. I work the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., which means I'm responsible for the cemetery during the hours when it's supposed to be completely secured. The work involves patrolling the grounds, checking buildings, ensuring that all access points remain locked, and documenting anything that seems out of place. It's straightforward work most of the time, though cemeteries at night have their own particular atmosphere that takes some getting used to. The combination of silence, darkness, and the awareness of being surrounded by graves creates a feeling that's more contemplative than frightening, but definitely distinct from other kinds of security work. Gate 7 sits at the far northeast corner of the cemetery, where the newer sections meet the old forest boundary. It's a heavy iron gate set into stone pillars, with a modern electronic lock that requires a keycard for access. The gate provides entry to a service road used primarily by the landscaping crew and occasional funeral processions that need access to the newer burial sections. During my 7 years at Pine Ridge, Gate 7 has rarely been used outside of normal business hours, and it's always been one of the most reliable access points in terms of security. The lock mechanism at Gate 7 is the same electronic system used at all our service entrances as a magnetic lock that engages automatically when the gate closes and requires a keycard or manual override to open. The system logs every access attempt, successful or failed, with timestamps that allow us to track exactly when each gate has been opened. It's reliable technology that's never given us problems with false readings or mechanical failures. I first noticed Gate 7 standing open on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was completing my final rounds before end of shift when I found the gate wide open, the heavy iron panels standing at full extension as if someone had deliberately opened them and left them that way. The electronic lock showed no record of any access attempts during the night, and there were no signs of forced entry or tampering with the mechanism. The gate was simply open, though it had been properly secured when I checked it at the beginning of my shift. I assumed someone had accessed the gate during the previous day and failed to secure it properly, though that seemed unlikely given the automatic locking system. I closed the gate, verified that the lock engaged correctly, and made a note in my security log about finding it unsecured. The next morning, Gate 7 was open again. Same situation. No access logs, no signs of tampering, just the gate standing open as if it had never been locked at all. I started paying closer attention to Gate 7 during my rounds, checking it more frequently than the other access points to see if I could identify when or how it was being opened. The pattern was consistent, properly locked at 11 p.m. when I started my shift, standing open at 6 a.m. when I made my final rounds. But during my midnight and 3 a.m. checks, the gate remained secure and locked. Whatever was opening, it happened between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., during the quietest part of the night, when I was usually patrolling other sections of the cemetery. The security footage from the camera covering Gate 7 showed nothing unusual, just empty frames of the locked gate standing in the darkness, no movement or activity that would explain how it was being opened. I reviewed several nights of footage, looking for any detail that might explain the mystery, but the camera showed only the static image of the gate area, with occasional changes in lighting as clouds passed over the moon or as dawn approached. I decided to position myself near Gate 7 during the early morning hours to observe directly what was happening. On a Thursday night, I set up in a location with a clear view of the gate, but far enough away that I wouldn't interfere with whatever process was causing it to open. I settled in with coffee and my radio, prepared to document whatever occurred between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. At 4:27 a.m., I watched Gate 7 open. Not gradually, not with the slow swing you'd expect from someone manually operating heavy iron panels, but smoothly and silently, as if controlled by some invisible mechanism. The lock indicator light went from red to green, though I heard no electronic sounds or clicks from the locking system. The gate panels swung open to their full extension and stopped, leaving the entrance completely accessible. But I saw no one operating the gate, no figure approaching the lock mechanism, no vehicle or equipment that might explain the opening, just the gate moving from closed to open position with no visible cause. I approached the gate cautiously, checking the lock mechanism and surrounding area for any explanation of what I'd witnessed. The electronic system showed no access attempts, though the gate was clearly unlocked and open. There were no footprints in the soft earth around the gate, no tire tracks or other signs that anyone had been in the area. The gate had opened itself, apparently, though that was impossible given the electronic lock system and the weight of the iron panels. I documented the incident in my security log and notified my supervisor about the recurring problem with Gate 7. The maintenance department examined the lock mechanism and found it functioning normally. The gate operated correctly during testing, locking, and unlocking in response to keycard access, exactly as designed. There was no mechanical explanation for why it would open spontaneously during the night. But the pattern continued. Every morning, Gate 7 stood open despite being properly secured the previous evening. I began checking it more frequently during my rounds, sometimes as often as every hour, trying to narrow down exactly when the opening occurred. The timing seemed to vary. Sometimes I'd find it open during my 3 a.m. check. Sometimes it remained locked until my final rounds. But it was always open by morning, always without any logged access attempts or signs of tampering. I started reviewing the security footage more carefully, examining each frame for details I might have missed during my initial reviews. The camera showed the gate area clearly, with good resolution and adequate lighting from nearby security lamps. Most nights, the footage showed nothing but the static image of the locked gate and surrounding landscape. But occasionally, usually just before dawn, there would be frames where the shadows seemed wrong. Not obviously wrong, not dramatically different from the surrounding frames, but subtly displaced in ways that didn't match the position of trees or the angle of artificial lighting. Shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source, creating momentary patterns that looked almost like figures passing through the gate area. The displacement was barely visible, easily dismissed as compression artifacts or camera anomalies, but it occurred consistently in the footage from nights when the gate was found open. I started staying later into my shift, watching the gate area during the early morning hours when the opening seemed most likely to occur. The shadows I'd noticed in the footage became more apparent when observed in real time. Between 5 and 6 a.m., as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, the shadows around Gate 7 would shift and move in ways that didn't correspond to any visible activity. The movement was subtle but persistent, like watching figures pass through an area where no figures could be seen. The shadows would elongate and contract, creating the impression of people walking through the gate opening even when the gate remained locked and the area appeared empty. It was as if something was passing through the space that cast shadows but had no visible substance, leaving only traces of movement that cameras could barely detect and eyes could barely perceive. The night I finally understood what was happening was a Friday in late October, when the morning air was cold enough to make breath visible, and the approaching dawn created clear contrast between light and shadow. I was positioned about 30 yards from Gate 7, watching for the shadow movement I'd learned to expect during the pre-dawn hours. At 5:38 a.m., the shadows began their familiar dance around the gate area. But this time, instead of just shapeless darkness moving independently of light sources, I could make out forms within the shadow patterns. Not clear enough to identify as specific individuals, but definitely human-shaped silhouettes moving through the gate opening as if it were already open, even though the heavy iron panels remained closed and locked. As I watched, more shadow figures appeared, creating a steady procession of dark forms passing through the solid gate. Men, women, children, a variety of sizes and shapes moving with purpose and familiarity, as if this passage was routine for them. None of the figures interacted with the physical gate mechanism, but they moved through the space as if no barrier existed. At 5:41 a.m., the electronic lock clicked from red to green, and the gate panels swung open smoothly. Not because someone had operated the mechanism, but because the steady stream of shadow figures had somehow influenced the physical world around them, opening a barrier that was blocking their accustomed path. I realized I was witnessing the daily passage of people who had been using Gate 7 long before electronic locks or security cameras existed, people who had established patterns of movement through these grounds that death hadn't changed. They continued to pass through their familiar route each morning, and the physical gate had learned to accommodate their passage rather than obstruct it. The shadow figures continued moving through the now open gate for several more minutes, a procession of forms that were barely visible but undeniably present. As the first direct sunlight touched the cemetery grounds, the shadows faded back into the normal patterns cast by trees and monuments, leaving Gate 7 standing open and the lock mechanism showing no record of any access. I never reported the shadow figures in my security logs, partly because I knew how impossible the explanation would sound, and partly because I'd come to understand that they weren't a security threat in any conventional sense. They were simply people continuing to use a path they'd established during life, moving through familiar territory at a time of day when the boundary between visible and invisible becomes temporarily permeable. Gate 7 still opens every morning, and I still close it during my final rounds before end of shift, but I no longer consider it a malfunction or security breach. It's simply the accommodation that Pine Ridge Cemetery makes for visitors who arrive on schedules that don't match normal operating hours, people who have reasons for passing through these grounds that extend beyond the practical concerns of locks and access control. Some doors refuse to stay closed because they serve purposes we don't fully understand, and sometimes the most important traffic through a cemetery happens during hours when no one expects to see it. Gate 7 opens each morning for travelers who cast shadows but leave no footprints, people making their daily passage through grounds where they have every right to be, even if they no longer qualify as visitors in any conventional sense. There are places in the earth that remember absence more clearly than they remember what was buried there. I'm Jose Ruiz, and I've maintained the grounds at Holy Cross Cemetery for 13 years. Started when I was 19, fresh out of high school, and needing steady work that didn't require a college degree. What began as temporary employment while I figured out my future became a career I genuinely care about. Cemetery maintenance isn't just landscaping. It's preserving spaces where families come to remember their loved ones, ensuring that every grave receives the dignity and attention it deserves. Over the years, I've learned that this work requires both practical skills and a deep respect for the sacred nature of burial grounds. Holy Cross spans 38 acres of gently rolling hills on the west side of town, with burial sections dating back to the 1890s. The older sections require more attention due to mature trees, uneven settling of graves over time, and headstones that need regular cleaning and maintenance. My responsibilities include mowing, landscaping, grave preparation, and addressing drainage issues that can develop in areas with clay soil and seasonal flooding. The work varies with the seasons, but it's always focused on keeping the cemetery looking peaceful and well-maintained for visitors. Plot B156 sits in Section B, about halfway up a modest slope where the original burials were laid out in neat rows during the early 1900s. It's an unremarkable plot marked with a simple granite headstone reading Eleanor Hastings, 1878 to 1954. The burial records show she was 76 when she died, with arrangements made by a nephew who handled her affairs after she passed away with no immediate family. Nothing unusual about the interment, no special requests or circumstances that would distinguish it from hundreds of other graves in that section. What I first noticed about Plot B156 was how it behaved during heavy rainfall. Holy Cross has drainage challenges in several areas due to clay soil that doesn't absorb water quickly, leading to temporary flooding around graves during spring storms or extended rainy periods. Most of Section B experiences these drainage issues, with water pooling around headstones and creating muddy conditions that can last for days after significant rainfall. But Plot B156 never held water, not just draining more quickly than surrounding graves, but seeming to absorb rainfall instantly, as if the earth there was always thirsty no matter how much moisture it received. During storms that left standing water throughout Section B, Eleanor Hastings' grave remained completely dry, the soil dark and moist, but never saturated or flooded like the plots around it. I assume the plot had better drainage due to some variation in soil composition or underground conditions that allowed water to filter away more efficiently. Graves can have different drainage characteristics based on factors like soil preparation during burial, the type of vault or casket used, or natural variations in the underlying clay layer. But the contrast was striking enough that I made a note to investigate further when time allowed. The drainage anomaly became more pronounced during the heavy rains of March, when Section B experienced flooding that lasted 3 days. Water stood 6 inches deep around most graves in that area, making maintenance work impossible until the ground dried out. But Plot B156 remained completely accessible throughout the flooding, the earth around Eleanor Hastings' headstone dark and rich-looking but never waterlogged or muddy. I started paying closer attention to how the plot responded to different weather conditions. Light rain, heavy downpours, extended periods of drizzle all produced the same result. Water would fall on Eleanor's grave and simply disappear, absorbed so quickly that the surface never showed signs of saturation. Meanwhile, adjacent plots would develop the expected puddling and muddy conditions that characterize poor drainage in clay soil. During a particularly heavy rainstorm in early April, I decided to observe Plot B156 directly to understand what was happening to the water. I positioned myself under a nearby tree with a clear view of Eleanor's grave and watched as rain fell steadily across Section B. The surrounding plots began accumulating water within minutes, creating the familiar pools and muddy patches I'd come to expect during heavy weather. But the rain falling on Plot B156 seemed to vanish the moment it touched the ground, not soaking in gradually like normal soil absorption, but disappearing instantly, as if the earth there had an unlimited capacity to accept moisture. I watched for over an hour, seeing consistent rainfall across the entire area but witnessing the complete absence of surface water accumulation on Eleanor's grave. I decided to investigate the subsurface conditions that might explain the unusual drainage. Using a hand auger, I began taking soil samples around Plot B156 to compare the composition with adjacent areas. The soil directly over Eleanor's grave felt different from the start, looser, less compacted than I expected for a burial site that was nearly 70 years old. As I worked the auger deeper, about 3 feet down, the resistance suddenly disappeared. Instead of the expected clay layer or settled soil, the auger dropped freely into what felt like an air pocket or void space. I tried different locations around the plot and found the same thing beneath a relatively thin layer of topsoil. There appeared to be empty space where there should have been solid ground. I brought in a longer probe to better understand the extent of the subsurface void. The results were disturbing. The entire area directly over Eleanor Hastings' grave was hollow, with a cavity that seemed to follow the outline of a standard burial plot. Not just loose soil or natural settling, but an actual empty space shaped like the rectangular depression where a casket would have been placed. Following proper protocols, I contacted my supervisor and the cemetery administrator to report the potential grave subsidence. Structural problems with burial sites require careful investigation and immediate attention to prevent safety hazards for visitors and staff. We arranged for a contractor to conduct a more thorough examination of plot B156 to determine what was causing the apparent void beneath the surface. The contractor used ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface conditions around Eleanor's grave. The results confirmed my findings. There was indeed a hollow space beneath the plot, roughly 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, extending about 7 feet below the surface. The void was clearly defined and appeared to have clean edges, as if something rectangular had been removed from the earth, rather than naturally decomposed or collapsed. Given the safety implications, we decided to excavate plot B156 to understand what had happened to create such an extensive subsurface void. The excavation required coordination with county health authorities and notification of any surviving family members, though our records showed no living relatives for Eleanor Hastings. The excavation revealed something I'd never encountered in 13 years of cemetery maintenance. About 6 feet down, we found the remains of what had once been a wooden casket knot, decomposed or gradually deteriorated, but completely collapsed inward, as if the contents had simply vanished and left the wooden structure with nothing to support. The metal hardware was still in place, and fragments of the wooden walls remained, but they had folded into the center of the burial space, creating a perfect outline of where a body should have been. But there was no body, no skeletal remains, no clothing fragments, no evidence that anyone had ever actually been buried in that casket. Just the collapsed wooden structure surrounding an empty space that had maintained its human-shaped outline for nearly 70 years. The contractor and cemetery administrator were as puzzled as I was. Bodies don't simply disappear from sealed caskets, especially wooden caskets that show clear evidence of having been properly buried. Even in cases of complete decomposition, there would be skeletal remains, dental work, or other evidence of human burial. But Eleanor Hastings' grave contained nothing except the outline of absence, a void that had preserved its shape while consuming every drop of water that fell on the ground above it. We consulted with the funeral home that had handled Eleanor's original burial in 1954, though their records from that period were incomplete. What documentation remained suggested a standard burial service with a wooden casket, conducted according to the practices common at that time. No unusual circumstances, no special requests, no indication that anything irregular had occurred during the interment process. The medical examiner examined the site, but found no evidence of grave tampering or body removal. The collapsed casket showed no signs of being disturbed from above, and the metal hardware remained in its original configuration. Whatever had happened to Eleanor Hastings' remains appeared to have occurred from within the burial space itself, leaving behind only the shaped emptiness that continued to absorb water with an insatiable thirst. We refilled the excavation with proper drainage material and restored the plot surface, though I continued to monitor plot B156 during subsequent rainfall. The unusual drainage characteristics persisted. Water falling on Eleanor's grave continued to disappear instantly, as if feeding something beneath the surface that could never be satisfied. The discovery changed how I understood my work at Holy Cross. Most graves hold their contents securely, preserving remains and maintaining the physical evidence of burial for decades or centuries. But plot B156 suggested that some departures are more complete than others, leaving behind emptiness that actively seeks to fill itself with whatever the earth can provide. I still maintain Section B as part of my regular duties, ensuring that all graves receive proper care and attention. But I've developed a different relationship with Plot B156, understanding it as a place where absence has taken on its own form of presence. The void beneath Eleanor Hastings' headstone continues to consume every drop of rain, every bit of moisture that falls within its boundaries, as if the emptiness left behind when she departed required constant feeding to maintain its perfect human shape. Some graves hold bodies, some hold memories, and some hold the precise outline of what was lost. Plot B156 holds nothing but the hunger for something to fill the space where Eleanor Hastings should have remained, a thirst that can never be satisfied because it's not seeking water, it's seeking the return of something that has moved beyond the reach of earth and clay and time. Memory has its own geography, and some places on the map exist only for those who refuse to let the forgotten stay buried. I'm Rachel Montgomery, and I've supervised grounds operations at Greenwood Cemetery for 10 years. Started in the office handling burial records and family communications, gradually moved into overseeing the physical maintenance of our 47 acres of burial grounds. It's demanding work that requires balancing respect for grieving families with the practical needs of maintaining a large cemetery. Every decision affects someone's experience of visiting their loved ones, so attention to detail and sensitivity to family concerns are essential parts of the job. Greenwood was established in 1879, with sections that reflect different eras of burial practices and community development. The oldest section contains graves from the late 1800s, many marked with elaborate Victorian monuments and family plots that required significant investment. But that section also includes areas where simpler burials took place, plots marked only with small stones or wooden markers that have long since deteriorated, leaving stretches of ground with no visible indication that anyone rests there. My responsibilities include coordinating with our maintenance crew, managing visitor services, ensuring compliance with state regulations, and addressing any issues that affect the cemetery's operations. The work involves both administrative duties and regular walks through all sections to monitor conditions and identify maintenance needs. Over the years, I've become familiar with every section of Greenwood, including the areas where graves exist without visible markers or clear documentation. The flower arrangements first appeared in late August, elaborate bouquets placed on unmarked plots in Section A, the oldest part of Greenwood. These weren't simple grocery store flowers or casual tributes, they were professionally arranged bouquets with exotic flowers, intricate design work, and clear evidence of significant expense and care. Each arrangement was placed on ground that showed no indication of being a burial site, areas where families rarely visit because there are no headstones or markers to identify specific graves. What made the flowers particularly puzzling was their placement on plots that our records couldn't definitively identify. Section A contains many graves from the 1880s and 90s where documentation is incomplete or has been lost over time. Some burials were recorded only in church registers that no longer exist. Others were marked with wooden markers that deteriorated decades ago. These forgotten graves represent people who died when record-keeping was less systematic, leaving us with burial grounds we know contain remains, but can't specifically identify. I assumed the flowers were cases of mistaken placement families, leaving tributes on what they believed were their relatives' graves, but getting the location wrong due to the absence of clear markers. It happens occasionally in older sections where people have family stories about burial locations, but no concrete evidence to guide them to the correct plots. But the pattern was too consistent for random error. Every few days, fresh flower arrangements would appear on different unmarked plots throughout Section A, always expensive and elaborate, always placed with obvious care and intention. The arrangements showed no signs of being moved or repositioned, suggesting whoever was placing them knew exactly where they intended to put each bouquet. I started checking the arrangements more closely during my daily walks through Section A, Each bouquet was accompanied by a small card or note, handwritten in careful script. The messages were identical every time. I remember you. Nothing more. No names or signatures. No indication of who was placing the flowers or why they'd chosen those particular unmarked locations. The handwriting was distinctive flowing cursive that suggested someone educated and deliberate, someone who took time to create beautiful lettering even for brief messages. The paper was high-quality stationery, cream-colored, with a subtle texture that indicated expense and attention to detail. Everything about the flowers and notes suggested someone with both financial means and deep emotional investment in honoring these forgotten graves. I decided to review our security camera footage to identify who was leaving the arrangements. Greenwood has basic camera coverage of the main entrances and central pathways, though the older sections have limited surveillance. I examined several weeks of footage, looking for anyone entering Section A during evening or early morning hours, when the flowers might be placed. The cameras showed nothing unusual: normal daytime visitors, occasional evening dog walkers on the adjacent pathway, maintenance crew members during working hours. But no one approaching the areas where flowers appeared, no vehicles stopping near Section A during overnight hours. The arrangement simply appeared between my evening checks and the next morning's walkthrough, as if materialized from nothing. I started staying later to observe Section A directly during the hours when flowers seemed most likely to be placed. The cemetery officially closes at sunset, but I have access to all areas for supervisory purposes. I positioned myself with a clear view of the section where arrangements had been appearing, prepared to identify whoever was tending these forgotten graves with such elaborate care. During several evenings of observation, I saw nothing. Section A remained quiet and empty, just rows of marked and unmarked graves in the gathering darkness. But each morning brought fresh flowers on different unmarked plots, always with the same handwritten note: I remember you. The mystery deepened when I realized the flowers were being placed on plots that corresponded to our oldest and most incomplete burial records. Using historical maps and church documents, I'd been working to identify some of the unmarked graves in Section A. The flower placements matched locations where I suspected burials existed but couldn't definitively prove people who died in the 1880s and 90s, often during epidemics or accidents that overwhelmed local record-keeping capabilities. I began researching the specific areas where flowers appeared, checking historical documents and newspaper archives for information about burials that might have taken place there. What I found was heartbreaking evidence of people who died alone, were buried without family present, or whose deaths were recorded only in brief mentions that provided no details about survivors or mourners. A seamstress who died during the influenza outbreak of 1891, a railroad worker killed in a switching accident with no known relatives, children who died of scarlet fever when their parents were too poor for proper monuments, people whose lives ended without anyone to ensure they'd be remembered, whose graves became unmarked not because families didn't care, but because families didn't exist or lacked resources for permanent markers. The flower arrangements began to feel less mysterious and more like acts of deliberate remembrance, someone taking responsibility for honoring people who had no one else to tend their graves, but who had access to historical records detailed enough to identify these specific forgotten burials. And how were they placing flowers without being detected by cameras or direct observation? I decided to leave a note at one of the flower arrangements, asking whoever was placing them to contact me so we could coordinate their tributes with our cemetery operations. The next morning, the flowers were gone, replaced by a fresh arrangement with a different note: some remembering must be done in private. The handwriting was the same flowing script, but the message suggested whoever was placing flowers knew I'd been trying to identify them. They were choosing to remain anonymous, to continue their work without official recognition or coordination. Their remembrance was intentionally private, hidden from observation and documentation. I continued monitoring Section A, but I stopped trying to catch whoever was placing flowers. Instead, I began documenting which unmarked plots received arrangements and researching the historical records to better understand who might be buried there. The work became a collaboration between my official documentation efforts and someone else's private acts of remembrance. The pattern continued through fall and into winter, flowers appearing regularly on different unmarked graves throughout Section A. Always elaborate arrangements, always expensive flowers, always accompanied by the simple message, "I remember you." The placement showed intimate knowledge of which specific areas contained forgotten burials, suggesting access to historical information that went beyond what was readily available to the public. During a particularly cold December evening, I made one final attempt to observe the flower placement directly. I positioned myself near Section A around sunset and waited, watching for any movement or activity in the area where arrangements had been appearing. The cemetery was quiet and still, with only the sound of wind through bare tree branches. At 9:37 p.m., I saw movement near one of the unmarked plots. Not a person walking or carrying flowers, but a gentle disturbance of shadows that seemed to gather around a specific area of ground. The movement was barely perceptible, more like a shift in the quality of darkness than any visible activity. But gradually, I became aware of a presence kneeling beside one of the unmarked graves, arranging something with careful deliberation. The figure was indistinct, visible only as a slightly denser area of shadow against the general darkness of the cemetery. I couldn't make out clothing, features, or any identifying characteristics, just the sense of someone engaged in purposeful, loving activity. The presence worked for several minutes, then gradually faded back into the surrounding darkness, until I could no longer distinguish any movement or activity. The next morning, a fresh flower arrangement sat on the plot where I'd observed the shadowy activity, elaborate white lilies and roses, arranged with professional skill and obvious care. The accompanying note read, "I remember you," in the same flowing handwriting I'd come to recognize. I realized I was witnessing remembrance that operated outside normal constraints of time and visibility, someone whose commitment to honoring the forgotten dead transcended the usual boundaries between past and present. Whether the flower placer was someone with historical knowledge and unusual discretion, or something more than human maintaining connections that death hadn't severed, the arrangements represented a form of care that filled gaps in official memory. The flowers continued to appear throughout Section A, always on unmarked plots where forgotten people rest without family to tend their graves. I've stopped trying to identify who places them, and instead focus on documenting which areas receive flowers, creating better records of burial locations that official documentation missed. Some forms of remembrance work best when they remain private, when they operate by their own rules rather than institutional procedures. Every morning brings fresh evidence that no one is truly forgotten, that somewhere in the space between memory and devotion, someone maintains connections to people who died alone and unmarked. The flowers in Section A represent love that transcends documentation, care that persists without recognition, and the quiet comfort that even the most forgotten graves receive attention from someone who refuses to let them rest unremembered. Some sounds carry messages you don't want to receive, especially when they come from 6 feet underground and follow a rhythm that suggests patience running out. I'm Michael Carlson, and I've been cemetery foreman at Riverside Memorial for 15 years. Started as a groundskeeper straight out of high school, worked my way up through equipment operation and crew supervision to managing all grounds maintenance for our 62 acres of burial sites. It's honest work that requires understanding both the technical aspects of cemetery maintenance and the emotional needs of families who trust us to care for their loved ones' resting places. Winter operations present particular challenges: frozen ground, equipment limitations, and the need to maintain access for funeral services regardless of weather conditions. Riverside dates back to 1893, with sections that reflect different eras of burial practices and community development. The older sections require more attention during winter months due to mature trees that drop branches, uneven terrain that creates drainage issues, and aging infrastructure that needs constant monitoring. My crew handles everything from snow removal and pathway maintenance to grave preparation in frozen ground, which requires specialized equipment and careful planning to ensure we can meet families' needs even during the harshest weather. Plot C203 sits in Section C, about a third of the way up a gentle slope where burials from the 1920s through 40s are concentrated. It's marked with a modest granite headstone reading, Harold Jensen, 1902 to 1947. According to our records, Harold was a machinist at the local foundry who died of a heart attack at 45, survived by a wife and 2 young children. Nothing unusual about the burial. No special circumstances that would distinguish it from hundreds of other graves from that era. The winter maintenance season typically runs from December through March, when frozen ground conditions require different approaches to cemetery operations. We use specialized equipment to break through frost layers for new burials, maintain heating systems for our maintenance buildings, and ensure that pathways remain accessible for families visiting graves during holiday seasons. The work is physically demanding in cold weather, but it's essential for maintaining cemetery operations year-round. I first heard the tapping during early December ground preparation work. My crew was using pneumatic equipment to break frost layers in Section C, preparing several plots for winter burials that families had scheduled. The work involves methodical soil preparation that requires listening carefully to equipment sounds to ensure proper operation and avoid damage to underground utilities or adjacent graves. But beneath the normal sounds of machinery and crew activity, I started noticing something else, a gentle, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the ground itself. Not the sharp sounds of metal on stone or the grinding of equipment under stress, but something softer and more deliberate, like someone tapping a finger against wood, patient and steady. At first, I assumed the sound was related to our equipment operation or some underground utility that was responding to the vibrations from our ground preparation work. Frozen ground can create unusual acoustic effects, and mechanical sounds can carry through soil in unexpected ways. But the tapping continued even when we shut down equipment for breaks, a steady rhythm that seemed to have its own source and timing. My crew started commenting on the sound during our second week of work in Section C. Tommy Rodriguez, who operates our pneumatic equipment, mentioned hearing what sounded like someone knocking from underground. Jake Morrison, who's worked cemetery maintenance for 8 years, described it as tapping that reminded him of someone trying to get attention politely but persistently. It's coming from right around that Jensen plot, Jake told me during our lunch break. Every time we work that area, there's this tapping. Sounds like it's maybe 6 feet down, directly under the headstone. I started paying closer attention to the sound during our Section C operations. The tapping was indeed most noticeable near plot C203, and it had a distinctly rhythmic quality that suggested purpose rather than random mechanical noise. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more taps, pause, continuing in a pattern that was too regular to be coincidental. What made the sound particularly unsettling was its timing. The tapping only occurred when the ground was completely frozen during those deep winter days when frost penetrated several feet below the surface. During milder periods, when surface thaw made the ground softer, the tapping would stop completely. It was as if the sound required frozen conditions to carry properly, or as if whatever was causing it could only operate when the earth was locked solid. I decided to investigate the subsurface conditions around plot C203 to determine if there was some structural explanation for the tapping. Cemetery plots can develop issues with vault settling, casket deterioration, or underground water flow that might create unusual sounds under certain conditions. I used ground-penetrating radar to examine the burial site, looking for any anomalies that might explain the acoustic phenomenon. The radar showed standard burial conditions, a metal vault containing what appeared to be an intact casket, properly positioned about 6 feet below surface level. No signs of structural collapse, water intrusion, or unusual cavity formation that might explain the tapping sounds. Everything appeared normal from a technical standpoint, though the sound continued during our work regardless of what the equipment revealed. The tapping intensified as winter deepened and ground frost became more severe. During January, When temperatures remained below freezing for weeks at a time, the sound became loud enough to hear clearly even over equipment noise. The rhythm remained consistent: 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, but the volume increased, as if whatever was causing it was working harder to be heard through increasingly frozen ground. My crew began to feel uneasy working near plot C203. The tapping was becoming impossible to ignore, and its persistence suggested something more than mechanical coincidence. Tommy mentioned that the sound reminded him of Morse code, though he couldn't identify any specific message in the pattern. Jake suggested we contact our equipment manufacturer to check if pneumatic tools could create acoustic effects that might explain what we were hearing. But the sound occurred even when no equipment was operating. During quiet moments when my crew was working other areas, I could stand near Harold Jensen's grave and hear the gentle, rhythmic tapping coming from directly below the headstone. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, continuing with metronomic regularity that suggested conscious intent rather than random mechanical activity. I researched Harold Jensen's background, thinking there might be some detail about his death or burial that would explain the acoustic phenomenon. The records were standard for someone who died in 1947 heart attack at work, survived by wife Margaret and children Robert and Susan. The funeral was conducted by Morrison Funeral Home, with burial in a standard metal vault using practices common at that time. But I did find one detail that stayed with me. According to his obituary in the local newspaper, Harold had been known for his precise work habits at the foundry. Co-workers described him as someone who worked with methodical rhythm, who could operate machinery by sound alone, and who was famous for his ability to diagnose mechanical problems by listening to engine patterns. He was someone whose entire professional life had been built around understanding the language of mechanical sounds. The tapping began to feel less random after learning about Harold's background. The rhythm was too precise, too purposeful for coincidence. It was as if someone with deep understanding of mechanical communication was trying to send a message using the only medium available from 6 feet underground sound, transmitted through frozen earth that could carry acoustic signals with clarity impossible during softer ground conditions. As February arrived and frost depths reached their seasonal maximum, the tapping became more insistent. The 3-tap pattern continued, but with increased urgency that suggested time pressure or growing frustration. My crew started avoiding Section C during early morning hours when the sound was most pronounced, scheduling our work there for later in the day when equipment noise could mask the underground tapping. But the pattern never varied, and it always stopped at exactly the same time sunrise. Not gradual fading or eventual cessation, but immediate silence the moment the first direct sunlight touched Harold Jensen's headstone. As if whatever was causing the sound operated on a schedule that ended precisely when day began, returning to some kind of dormancy that would last until the next period of deep cold and darkness. The timing worried me more than the sound itself. The tapping suggested someone or something that was active during the deepest, coldest part of winter nights, working patiently through frozen darkness but stopping when dawn arrived, and winter was finite. Eventually, spring would come, ground would thaw, and whatever was causing the tapping might be able to do more than just send acoustic signals through frozen earth. I started lying awake at night, thinking about what happens to sounds that can only travel through frozen ground. When the earth thaws, does the energy behind those sounds find other ways to express itself? When the barrier of frozen soil disappears, what emerges from burial sites where something has been working patiently all winter to communicate or escape? The last time I heard the tapping was during the final week of February, when overnight temperatures were still dropping below freezing, but daytime thaw was beginning to soften surface soil. The sound was fainter, as if the partially thawed ground was interfering with transmission, but the rhythm remained consistent. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, always stopping exactly at sunrise. Then March arrived, and the ground began its annual transition from frozen to soft. The tapping from plot C203 stopped completely, but my anxiety about Harold Jensen's grave increased. Something that had been working all winter to send messages through frozen earth was now dealing with conditions that might allow more direct forms of communication or movement. I still manage grounds maintenance at Riverside Memorial, and I still supervise winter operations in all sections, including Section C. But I've developed a different relationship with Plot C203, understanding it as a place where someone continues to work on projects that require the specific conditions that only deep winter provides. The tapping hasn't returned since that February, but every winter I find myself listening for it, wondering if Harold Jensen has finished whatever he was working on down there, or if he's simply waiting for the right conditions to resume his patient, rhythmic communication from 6 feet below. Some sounds carry messages we're not equipped to understand, and some messages are better left undelivered. But when spring comes early and winter ends before its normal time, I worry about projects left unfinished underground, about communications that were cut short by thawing earth, and about what patient workers might do when they no longer have frozen ground to carry their carefully tapped signals to those of us who walk above their resting places.